Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 4th of January. Last class, what I did was I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline and our Moodle site, and I asked that you introduce yourself on our discussion forum. That would count for your attendance for that class. Today, I wanted to talk about the first 3 chapters in the textbook, Speech in Higher Ed, Getting Started in Critical Listening, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about Toastmasters. But before I get to any of that, I didn't finish talking about plagiarism, which was on our syllabus. And as I'm sure you've heard about in other classes, plagiarism is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So it's considered comparable to theft, but it's intellectual property that's being stolen rather than, let's say, a product. And in terms of the repercussions, they can be pretty serious. If you were to get off easy, you could flunk the assignment. If you weren't getting off easy, you could actually be expelled from college with a notation on your transcript indicating that you plagiarized. So it's a pretty serious offense. And what I've seen is that usually plagiarism is usually quite deliberate. I think that students are very well aware when they're using somebody else's language or ideas and they aren't acknowledging the source. That's different from making errors with documentation. And you've probably heard in English and other classes that there are multiple systems devoted to different disciplines on how to go about documenting. The good news is with public speaking is that things are much simpler in relation to documenting, and that all you need to do is just to find a way to notify your audience that you are not citing your own material. You don't have to give the level of detail that you would normally give, let's say, in a piece of writing. That said, you should be prepared to give that level of detail if you are asked by an audience member. But the reality is, in the context of delivering a speech, you just want to make sure that your audience is fairly comfortable with understanding which material is yours and which isn't, which we'll talk about as the semester progresses. And I always give 2 stories about plagiarism to encourage students not to plagiarize. The first occurred to me in my early days of teaching, so this would be the early days of the internet. And that meant that I was not able to look on the internet to try to find where this student had plagiarized from, because I was well aware that I had recognized that piece of writing, but I just couldn't place where. And I'm not sure if you're aware that as many sites as exist on the internet to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sites to help professors determine if students are plagiarizing. One of those is called turnitin.com, one of my favorites. And then I can type in a sentence or a paragraph, and then there's an electronic search. But at any rate, I didn't have access to that, and I needed to rely on my memory. And it wasn't really hard for me to identify where the original source was, because it was actually from our class textbook that I had ordered for the course. And with a few errors, I'm not sure if the student had hoped that if there were a few errors that I would be misled and not realize it was from our textbook, or perhaps they were just sloppy and recopying. The better story actually happened around the same time period to a middle-aged professor. And this was all over the news. And it's important that this be a middle-aged professor. He's reading a group of papers and he realizes that something sounds familiar. And again, not really able to rely on the internet to do a search, he had to rely on his memory. And as he's contemplating where had he read this before, it occurred to him he hadn't read it, he had written it. Decades earlier, when he was an undergraduate student, it was one of his old papers. And the specifics of it, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that it has something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers from old fraternity members. And somehow, some way, this professor actually got a copy of his own paper decades later. And I usually don't feel too badly for students who plagiarize, but I think I feel badly for this student, that not only was he handing in his own professor's work, but he also was featured in the media, because what are the chances of such a thing happening? So I always use that as motivation, shall we say, if anybody's ever tempted to plagiarize. But as I indicated, for your first speech, you do not need to use outside resources because your first speech will be an autobiographical speech. You'll be talking about yourself. So I suspect that there really won't be any kind of temptation or need to plagiarize. And then by the time we do get to the part of the semester where you are using outside resources, we'll talk about how to document that so that it's clear to your audience when you are quoting from another source. So that first speech, and you can see that below these videos, I've got notes for the class. So this is section 2 that I'm on now. Speech number 1, autobiographical, is going to be due on Monday, the 10th of January, because as you know, this is a very condensed semester. And your assignment is to give a 5-minute autobiographical speech that tells the audience something about you and your life. You could do something like a life overview, highlighting important elements of your life. You could do something like focus on a particular interest or hobby. You could do something like talk about an educational goal. And over the next few classes, we'll be talking a little bit more about how you would go about formulating a speech, and specifically the autobiographical speech. Now, in terms of speech delivery, you remember that I had mentioned last class that you have the option of either delivering your speech live via Zoom or uploading your speech onto our Moodle site. So if you believe that you think you would like to deliver your speech live via Zoom, please send me an email, and that's at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, about your times of availability on Monday, the 10th. And what I will try to do is to find a common time. And again, you're not required to deliver your speech via Zoom. Certainly you can upload it on Monday the 10th. And then ultimately your peers will watch that so that you'll be able to get a sense of what the class looked like as a whole in terms of their speeches. So I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about something that was not in the text, because I'm well aware that you might still be trying to get a hold of textbooks. And while it would be lovely if you had done the reading that was assigned for today, I'm well aware that you may not have had the opportunity to. So I wanted to begin with an organization known as Toastmasters, which again was not listed or indicated anywhere in our readings. It's an organization that helps members improve their public speaking skills. And you can see in the notes below, this is section 3, I've got the website if you wanted to click on that and to look a little bit into the Toastmasters organization. And they've got sites basically internationally. But they also came out with a video in which they talked about writing and delivering great speeches, which I usually show in class, but luckily I was able to find it online. So what I would like you to do is to watch that. It's approximately a half hour long or so, and it basically goes through the overview of how to write and deliver a speech. You can think of it as a kind of summary of what it is that we will be talking about over the course of the semester. So this is in section 4 in the notes below, and you can see the web link. So this would be a good time for you to stop watching my video and to watch the Toastmasters video, and then you can go back to my video, and that would be at 8 minutes and approximately 15 seconds. So here we are at 8 minutes and 15, 16, 17 seconds. And you can, I hope, see that the Toastmasters video gives us a sense of how we would go about delivering a speech. And I have some notes from that particular video in the 4th section about how speeches generally can be divided into categories, whether they be informative, which means that they need to be very clear and concise, whether they be persuasive, which means they need to motivate an audience to take action, and usually they do so through emotion, or they're entertaining, and that means that they utilize things like stories and humor. And while we don't have an entertaining speech, we do have the autobiographical speech, and I always think of that as rather entertaining. And in fact, I think these divisions are somewhat artificial, because I think all good speeches entertain, and all good speeches inform, and all good speeches persuade. So if you think about your first speech, the autobiographical speech, it will be informative because you will be teaching us a little bit about your life history. And in some ways, it's persuasive as well, because the assumption is that whatever it is that you're sharing about yourself has a certain level of importance. And the video emphasized the idea of practicing. And I can't emphasize it enough as well. And as we get a little bit closer to the speech, I will be setting up times where we can communicate individually with one another about how things are going with your first speech before you actually deliver it. We'll do that as well with the second and the third speech. The video talked about the importance of preparation, thinking about things like the logistics, the location, the audience, the objective, whether any kind of research is going to be necessary, and then actually writing an outline of the speech, where you have an introduction, a discussion section, sometimes known as body, and conclusion. The introduction gives basically your greeting, and it gives also your thesis, your main point. The discussion section or the body gives your evidence and details. The conclusion basically gives a sense of closure to the speech, and it's your farewell to the audience. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it is the structure of your typical composition with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. The difference is that, of course, a speech is presented. So that means you have to think about the presentation elements. Things like, are you being conversational? You don't want to sound too stilted. You don't want to read your speech because you want to be able to have some sort of eye contact and communication with your audience. Instead, what you want to have is some sort of a speaking outline, which we will be talking about further, with key ideas in place so that you could refer to that outline if your mind happened to wander. You want to think about eye contact, and this is tricky. I can say if you are being recorded, the idea is that the camera serves as your audience contact, your eye contact in that respect. Body language, vocal inflections, and also trying to anticipate audience questions as much as you can prior so that you can be prepared. And also think about pacing, sometimes pausing for dramatic emphasis or just slowing down can be very useful. I can say that this is one of my biggest challenges because I tend to speak very quickly. I suppose it's the New Yorker in me, which is where I was born and raised. But at any rate, that video, I think, does a really nice job of sort of giving an overview. And for the notes for the video, you might notice that there was one thing that was missing in the notes that I deliberately left off. And the video talked about nervousness. And I think that is a very common experience that individuals have when they're speaking in front of the public, in part because they usually don't have much practice speaking in front of the public. So that's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, if you're curious, on our discussion forum. Certainly the readings talk about ways that you can reduce nerves and anxiety, but I suspect you probably have your own ideas and techniques as well. So that's what I'm going to ask you to share on our discussion forum. And you will see that this is listed at the very ending of our notes for our attendance question, which would be due Wednesday the 5th by 9 a.m. And again, if you need additional time, just ask me for an extension. What suggestions do you have to control nervousness and why? And of course, you're encouraged to participate and interact with your classmates, but not required to. I will be interacting with all of you and that I will be giving responses. What you are required to do, though, is to read all of your classmates' responses so we could try to duplicate what you would have heard in a classroom experience. So the textbook, the first 3 chapters are meant to sort of prepare you in terms of delivering a speech. The first, chapter 1, is about higher education and public speaking, about why it's important to be well-versed in communications and public speaking. And they give us some terminology in the textbook. Oftentimes it's bolded, and there are summaries at the ending of the chapters talking about main points. And that's usually what happens when you get to an introductory class, is that you're introduced to a lot of vocabulary that's associated with that discipline. So they talk about imperatives, that there's an intellectual imperative, a social imperative, and a consumer imperative for why we study public speaking in higher education. The intellectual imperative is about just being a well-educated person, and that there are certain disciplines you should have some knowledge of: history, science, literature, mathematics, so forth. And if you think about the early days of literature, it was an oral tradition where you had the great epic poets basically reciting poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And fortunately, they were written down so that we have documentation so that we can read these poems today. There is also, outside of academia, a social imperative for human interaction that we will be in situations where we need to present publicly, whether it be something like a job interview, or it could be something like a social event, a wedding, for instance. But in one way or another, we are going to have to interact with others. And there also is a consumer imperative, which I've become much more interested in as time has gone on. The idea that we don't just deliver speeches, but we consume speeches as audience members. And I can say that this is a challenging class to teach because while we talk about the techniques that a good public speaker should utilize, you will experience public speakers in the media and in other venues that don't follow these techniques, and they are rewarded with power, fame, money. And if we were to do the same, we would basically fail in an academic setting. And my response to you is that we need to hold these individuals accountable to the same level that we would hold ourselves accountable. That if we need to be clear, and we need to be well organized, and we need to have evidence to support our points, then we should expect the same from individuals such as politicians or anyone else who's put in a leadership position where they are speaking in front of the public. Now, public speaking is a kind of circular activity in that, yes, there is a speaker who gives a message to the audience, but it doesn't stop there because then the audience gives feedback. It could be very obvious feedback, like raising a hand, for instance, or perhaps yawning, or it could be less obvious feedback. But a good public speaker should be able to read their audience, at least within reason, and adapt accordingly. So again, things might be going very well as a public speaker. You tell a joke and it turns out that your audience finds it very humorous. Perhaps you might want to tell a second joke because the first one went so well. But if you were to tell the joke and no one laughed, perhaps it's best not to tell that second joke. And again, there's only so much you can do within the moment because you want to have your speech prepared ahead of time. Certainly, you can change direction in the course of the speech, but as we will discuss, that can be dangerous. It's very similar to not following, let's say, the MapQuest or your navigational guide. Sure, you can do it, but there are risks associated with it. So you need to be cautious about that. And if the speaker gives, or I should say, if the audience gives the speaker feedback and then the speaker adapts their message that goes back to the audience, you can see how this is a circular loop. And one term that's introduced in the reading that might sound somewhat familiar to you is called ethos, which means ethics. Notice how similar it is to the word ethics, credibility, and that sometimes speakers have to give information at the beginning of the speech in order to have ethos or credibility. But you all have built-in ethos or credibility with your first speech, your autobiographical speech, because it's about yourself. So we assume no one is more of an expert on that subject than you are. And we do want speakers to be ethical, which gets back to the idea of the consumer imperative, where I'm sure we've experienced speeches where we have a speaker who isn't being ethical. And again, we should hold that particular speaker accountable, just like we would hold ourselves accountable. So those are the main points that I wanted to talk about in that first chapter. So if you didn't have a chance to read it, you can read it after the fact. But this gives you an idea of what it was about. The second chapter is about getting started, which is exactly what we are doing. We are getting started. And the process that one would go through, in the textbook, they listed almost as a staircase visual. Selecting and narrowing the topic is the first level. That's where we're all at now. The speech is about yourself, the autobiographical speech, but I haven't given you direction about what to talk about in terms of yourself. And again, it's going to have to be something that's narrowed down so that it's about 5 minutes, give or take a little bit. But the idea is that as the speeches get longer, you have more latitude. Certainly, you don't want to have a 5-minute speech that goes over by 5 minutes because that's basically 100% of the time. But if you had an hour speech that went over 5 minutes, that wouldn't necessarily be that terrible. So it's a question about the balance. So you want to try to get someplace in the area of about about 5 minutes. So figure 4.5 minutes to 5.5 minutes, someplace in that window. Determining the purpose of the speech. And you might decide, well, that's easy. The purpose of the speech is so I can satisfy the requirement, so that I can earn a good grade, so that I can get my degree, and so forth and so on. And yes, that is the purpose. But there are other purposes as well. From my perspective, the purpose of this speech is to give you the opportunity to try out the suggestions that the textbook, Toastmasters, and I will have about delivering speeches. It also is a way for us to get to know one another in class. So at the ending of speech one, we should have a little bit more information about each other than we do now. And there might be very individual preferences. You might have or very individual purposes. You might want to impress someone in the class with your particular speech. There could be any of a host of purposes, but basically the general purpose of the speech is to satisfy that requirement for the autobiographical speech of letting the audience know a little bit about yourself. Analyzing the audience and occasion. Again, you know who your audience is, your classmates. And the occasion, it happens to be an academic setting, so you want to have a certain level of formality. But that said, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the level of formality that we might have had in the past doesn't necessarily exist. You certainly don't need to dress up in order to deliver your speech, but you do want to look neat and you want to look presentable. And I say that to my in-person classes as well as my online classes. But certainly in our particular time period, I think that there is less expectation about formality just in general. So you do want to analyze the audience and the occasion. And I always give a story about how a student didn't do this. It wasn't one of my students. It was a colleague of mine at another institution. I won't tell you which one. But basically the student was giving a speech about being true to oneself. So it's a very philosophical speech. What the student began to do was to remove articles of clothing during the speech. And then finally, when the student was about to remove his pants, the instructor intervened and said, "Stop, what are you doing?" And the student said, "Well, this speech is about being true to yourself, and I want to show you the true me." And the instructor said, "We've seen quite enough of you. Thank you very much." And might I suggest that the student had not analyzed the audience nor the occasion, that this was an academic setting. And it looks like the student had intended to completely disrobe in class. There is shock value to that, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the advantages of shock value, but there are also disadvantages. And let me just say that if you learn nothing else this semester, please don't disrobe when you are delivering a speech. Gathering material. And again, for your first speech, you probably won't need to do outside research because you are familiar with the subject matter. But certainly if you wanted to interview family members or look up records from Ellis Island or whatever the case may happen to be, you're free to do so. But as the speeches progress, once we get to the informative speech, you might need to gather information depending on how well you do or don't know the subject that you are discussing. You get to choose which subject with my approval. And by the persuasive speech, everyone will have to gather outside information and incorporate that into the context of the speech. So by that point, we'll talk about how to go about doing that. Making a speaking outline. And the speaking outline is different than the written outline. A written outline, which you might be familiar with academic papers, is usually pretty detailed. The more detailed, the better, because that means that you've got a good plan ahead of you. It's a map, if you will, so that you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what to write about because you've got it in your outline. It's different with your speaking outline. Less is more. Because if you've got too much text, well, then that's just going to distract you and you're not going to be able to maintain things like eye contact with your audience. So you want just key words and phrases. We'll talk a little bit more about this. And you can even look at our notes below and see that that's basically what I'm doing in our notes, just key words and phrases. And I actually use these notes when I present my videos so that I can look down and know basically the points that I want to talk about. Practicing out loud. And again, I'll be setting up some times where we can all connect, whether it be through Zoom or it be through telephone or it just be through email or chat about how things are going with the speech. And then finally, the delivery of the speech, which will be next week. So this means, because we are very condensed, is that you have 2 speeches next week. You have the autobiographical at the beginning of the week and the informative at the ending of the week. And then week 3 is when you've got your last graded speech, and that's the persuasive speech. So I deliberately didn't want to have any speeches due this week because this is our first week. I wanted you to have the weekend to be able to prepare. And while you are certainly preparing for your first speech, you can at least begin to contemplate ideas about what you might like to discuss for your informative speech, which will be 10 minutes, and what you might like to discuss for your persuasive speech, which will be 15 minutes. And sometimes I have students who choose a topic that basically connects all 3 speeches, but you don't have to do that. Your 3 speeches can be completely independent of one another. But considering how condensed the semester is, even though you're preparing for your autobiographical speech, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea to think a little bit about informative speeches and persuasive speeches. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And then finally, chapter 3 that I had assigned is about critical listening, about our role as audience members. And the difference between hearing, which is processing sound, which most people can do if they aren't deaf, as opposed to listening, which means really paying attention and thinking about what's being said. And there are all kinds of barriers associated with paying attention, and I'm sure we've all experienced them, though we may not necessarily have experienced the language that's used to talk about them in the context of public speaking or rhetoric. Perceptual fields. The internal perceptual field, which you probably know as daydreaming. This is internal or inside of oneself. And that ultimately we think more quickly than an individual can speak. So eventually our mind wanders, and one thought leads to the next, that leads to the next, and before you know it, we've lost a chunk of time, and that means a chunk of content. It's one of the reasons why we encourage students to take notes, because if they are busy taking notes, they're less likely to have their mind wander. And it also is a reason why teachers will use things like visuals, the idea of trying to keep an audience's attention. So that internal perceptual field, or the daydreaming, is one reason why we don't pay attention. And the other is the external perceptual field. So if internal is inside, external is outside, the environment. Things like temperature and lighting, and some of those things you can't control. Obviously, if there's a noise in the environment and you happen to be delivering a speech live, there isn't anything you're going to be doing about that. But certainly there are things that you can control. So if you can, within the best of your ability, and if you remember being in a classroom where a teacher is constantly opening and closing the door, it's probably because they're trying to control the external perceptual field, whether it be the temperature or the noise level or a combination of the two. Certainly that's what I remember from when I was teaching in person. And the textbook gives you some questions to consider when you are listening to speeches, questions that might help you stay focused. I also have a speech rating handout that is in our syllabus and document section. I'll talk about both in greater depth next class. So this should also help you not just pay attention, but help you think about what elements are going to be important in your particular speech. In fact, in the syllabus and other documents section, that template that I have for speech ratings is the template I'm going to be using for evaluating your first speech. I don't bother to use that template for the second or the third speech because I just basically take individual notes based on your individual speech. But I did want you to have access to that template and also think about how you could utilize that template, not just in evaluating your own speech, but in evaluating the speeches of others. So we'll talk about that next class, where I've scheduled Chapter 7, which is about organizing and outlining, Chapter 8, which is about the beginnings and endings of speeches, and Chapter 9, which happens to be about the wording of speeches. So that'll do it for today's class. And again, with our class discussion forum, which is going to be due on Wednesday, the 5th of January at 9 a.m., what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.